Okay, welcome Geeks on a plane onto the Cribb. This is our home here in Dubai. And welcome Turn 8 and i360 accelerator teams. By the way, they are in the middle of their accelerator round, so they're so excited to pitch.
What are you doing here? You should be working.
Get out of here! You got the flavor. What are you getting? Okay. All right. So we're just gonna do a quick, hard knock talk with Dave here, and so we'll do a quick interview, and then we'll open it up for questions. Okay. So let's start. Welcome, Dave, to Dubai and to the Cribb. And I know this is the third time. So
it's my third time in Dubai.
Excellent. So what do you think? Why you're here 3 times?
I hear they have really big buildings and they have some great nightclubs. Maybe 1 or 2 startups.
Maybe 1 or 2 startups. Okay. Well, you'll see 12 today, so that's pretty cool. So excellent. So I was with you in Turkey, and you went to Amman, and you're here in Dubai. What is all this Geeks on Airplane? Why are you in the Middle East?
Well, we started doing Geeks on a Plane about 4 years ago. Actually, before I started 500 Startups, when I was still at Founders Fund. Mainly because I'd been going to Japan pretty frequently with my wife's families over there. And I'd wanted to learn more about Asia. So we did our first trip to Tokyo, Beijing, and Shanghai. And we brought about 20, 25 people over to those 3 cities, and we got to see a lot of what was going on in Asia, and some different business models than maybe the US was used to at the time. A lot of companies that were doing gaming, a lot of mobile companies when mobile was not as popular as it is now in the US. And we just had a great experience, and since then we've done about 14 of these trips. We've done actually 4, this is our 4th trip this year. And each trip we try and take a group of maybe 20 to 40 people. We try and visit 3 or 4 cities in kind of new markets, or at least markets that are not familiar to folks from maybe the US. And it's a great opportunity to meet new entrepreneurs, new geeks, other investors, talk a little bit about how Silicon Valley operates, but also learn a lot about how other parts of the world operate. More and more we've been trying to pay attention to what's going on in the Middle East, particularly the Arabic-speaking market, which we think is a really big growth opportunity. Probably 300 to 500 million speakers over the next decade. Widely fragmented in lots of different demographic situations, but still pretty strong growth opportunity. And even though a lot of technology comes out of Silicon Valley, really most of the growth markets that we're interested in are in other places. So Latin America, East Asia, Southeast Asia, Middle East, and now even Africa and other places. So we've started making investments in the Middle East. I think since last year we've made 5 investments in Jordan, 1 in Turkey, looking at maybe 1 in Saudi, and probably we'll make maybe 5 to 10 investments a year, maybe more, as we start learning more about the region.
Excellent. Talking about investment, a little bit of what is 500 startup. I know it's becoming 1 million startup, but it's very soon. So you exceeded the 500, I guess.
So we're a little different than most other venture capital funds. In a lot of ways, the ideas that I started with were coming out of maybe some challenges that I experienced as an engineer and an entrepreneur, and things that we thought could be added to the model for both accelerator and for seed funds. A basic philosophy is that we invest in a lot of companies, and the reason is because we think, unfortunately, even though we're getting better at startups, most startups fail. And so as an investor, we try and have a large sample size solution to that. We kind of expect that maybe about 1/3 of our portfolio will be successful at some scale, but probably only 5 to 10% of portfolio will really have large outcomes. But we kind of feel because we're investing in a lot of companies, we're going to find some great ones, and also a lot of good companies too. So it gives us an opportunity to make a lot of bets, and even though maybe most of those don't work out, a few of those hopefully do. And in addition to making a lot of little bets, we try and make those bets in lots of places. Because each of our investments is a relatively small percentage, we can actually take quite a bit more risk than the average VC, which is probably why we've been able to do investments around the world. We've actually made investments in over 40 countries, probably about 150 to 200 companies out of the total, which I think is maybe about 600 investments so far.
You're very well known for being extremely honest and to the point, and
loudmouth maybe.
Loudmouth, okay. So it's such a difficult thing to invest outside the U.S. I mean, so why is you are one of the very few is looking at outside the U.S. What really motivates you about? Even it's political turmoil, especially in the Middle East.
Yeah, I think growing up, I grew up in West Virginia, but also in Maryland. As I went through high school and then college on the East Coast, I ended up having a lot of friends from a lot of places. A lot of Indian Americans, Korean Americans, African Americans, and people who had connections around the world. I ended up marrying a woman who was Japanese. Actually, when I was in college, I was going out with a woman who was Pakistani. So I always experienced a lot of different cultures, and I have a really strong belief that there's talent and amazing people all over the planet. So even though a lot of the world looks to Silicon Valley for original ideas and innovation, but I really think that most of the people who come to Silicon Valley are coming from other places. We were talking tonight that Steve Jobs is actually Syrian by heritage, and a lot of folks, the Google guys were part Russian, the Yahoo guys were part Chinese. There's just been a lot of talent that comes to Silicon Valley from many different parts of the world. And looking at where a lot of the investment is concentrated right now, it's in a very small area. It's really mostly. I think about a third of the world's venture capital is deployed in Northern California, another big chunk of that maybe on the East Coast. So it's pretty concentrated in a very small number of people and geographies, and it's mostly focused on the English-speaking market. And even though that's a very big market, the last time I checked, there was about 6.7 billion people who don't live in the U.S., and probably at least 3 to 5 billion people who don't speak English. And if you look at the global languages around the world, Mandarin, Spanish, Arabic, Hindi, Portuguese, those are all pretty strong growth markets. Maybe not Mandarin so much, but the others are. Certainly China is experiencing a lot of growth economically. So really, I think if we're looking forward over the next 10 years where we're going to see growth and innovation, it's probably going to be coming from outside the U.S. as much as inside the U.S. And so, 500 Startups is only about 3 or 4 years old. We have to also think about how we compete with other funds in the Valley. And I think operating in the shadow of, organizations like Y Combinator and other, venture capital funds that have been around for a long time, we had to think different about where we were going to, create a strategy. So a lot of where we decided the opportunity was to, create a bridge between Silicon Valley and other major developing markets in the world. And we've made a pretty decent dent in that so far, but you just wait. I think we're going to do a lot more over the next 5 to 10 years.
So investing outside the U.S., great. I mean, talked about all these different opportunities, but it comes with massive cost.
Fair amount of risk and cost.
A fair amount of risk and cost. So what are these risk and cost, and what can we tell these entrepreneurs how to loosen up this risk a little bit? So
from a very nuts and bolts point of view, most U.S. investors want to invest in U.S. incorporated entities. It's very difficult for them even to invest outside Silicon Valley and New York. Many times they don't like to get off their butts and do anything that's more than a 30-minute drive or a 3-hour plane ride. But there's real reasons for also that conservatism and strategy. There's a lot of standards that have been established in Silicon Valley in terms of incorporation, in accounting, in finance structure. There's lots of connections between venture capitalists who operate very well together. There's lots of platform companies that are natural acquirers for many technology companies that are in Silicon Valley, or at least in that general area. So there's good reasons for people to be deploying capital in the U.S. and in Silicon Valley because it's what they know, and they've become very proficient and efficient at making those companies work. So for a lot of venture capitalists, the risks in looking at other legal structures than the U.S., other markets that might not be as concentrated, the lack of exits and acquisitions, the lack of even downstream capital is probably one of the biggest risks that we face a lot of the time. Those are all very challenging to kind of see where you're going to find opportunities because even if you find talented teams, there may be challenging legal structure. Earlier angel investors may take a big chunk of the company. You might not be able to find seed stage or even Series A investors. There may be a lack of exits and opportunities for those companies to return capital. There may be a lack of mentorship and guidance in many markets where there haven't been 4 or 5 generations of companies that have had success. So I think you're still, there are many reasons why venture capitalists are risk averse in going to these other markets. But at the same time, for those same reasons I just mentioned before about all the demographics and opportunity, again, most of the growth is going to be happening in these markets. So, when we as venture capitalists are looking at investing in companies, there's a lot of risks that we need to manage and mitigate around the structure of the company, the financing of the company, the path to downstream capital and eventual exit, as well as maybe hiring and education. Boy, that's really pessimistic, right? That didn't appeal to any of you guys.
Yeah, exactly. Everybody.
So on the entrepreneur side, a lot of similar challenges in getting an investor's attention. Now, not every business needs venture capital. There have been many, many successful businesses that never raised a dime of venture capital. There's a lot of businesses that just raised, angel investor money and then went on to greater success without raising money from larger VCs. But to the extent that companies are interested in raising money from high-risk venture capital, they need to be thinking about how do they create big opportunities, how do they scale and grow, how do they develop their teams, and whether or not they decide to sell to an acquirer or aim for a public exit at some point. There's a lot of things that they need to figure out on that path. And one thing that's really been tremendous about being in Silicon Valley is you stand on the shoulders of giants. You may have heard that expression before. And pretty much really 50 years of companies, in some cases really even more than that. The history of Silicon Valley probably started somewhere in the 30s or 40s during the World War II efforts, maybe even a little bit before. A lot of the vacuum tube technologies that were developed and eventually into the microprocessors, that was funded by a lot of defense spending originally. Later, Will Shockley and Shockley Semiconductor, and then you may have heard of the story of the traitorous 8. There were 8 really talented engineers that left Shockley Semiconductor, started Fairchild Semiconductor, and then many of those folks started other companies and even started venture capital firms. So there's really been easily 50 years and maybe even more than 50 years of entrepreneurship and investment that's been happening in that area. And really a lot of mentorship and guidance, a lot of successful entrepreneurs and exits who put money back into the system. That ecosystem is not created overnight in other places. And I think the prevailing story in most other parts of the world is that it can never be recreated. I don't believe that. I don't think that's true, but I do think it probably takes time. And so when people are looking at creating their version of Silicon Valley in their own backyard, they tend to be a little impatient in thinking that, oh, well, we didn't get it done in the last 5 years. Like, well, hey, it took 50 years to get that going. So I think we need to be a little patient, and we really try to be encouraging. I think that, even though there may not be a history of exits in most of those markets, we're starting to see big companies being created in lots of places. So Baidu in China, Skype in Estonia, Yandex and Mail.ru in Russia, lots of big e-commerce companies in many different geographies. So I think the future is bright and the prospects are very bright, again, thinking about the demographics and opportunities. But most of those geographies have at best 5 to 10 years of of entrepreneurial experience, maybe 10 to 20 if you consider other things that aren't explicitly tech. And so building up the mentorship programs, building up the investors in those ecosystems, building up the education and talent is always challenging. And as an entrepreneur, you face a lot of uphill obstacles in trying to build your businesses in places that aren't as concentrated as the US or Silicon Valley. But at the same time, there's lots of other things that are happening in the overall, at least internet ecosystem, that are bringing costs down and flattening the world in terms of education and access. And even now, platforms like AngelList, full disclosure, we're an investor in AngelList, things like that are bringing access to capital and access to mentorship and education to companies all over the world.
Yeah, exactly. So, just being realistic as you are, a lot of the entrepreneurs, at least the ones I meet, they are dreaming to be the Instagrams and the Twitters of the world. And I'm, a little bit.
I'm probably not a big fan of
that. I'm not a big fan of that. So what's your word? I mean, talking about exits, talking about success stories, talking about how far can they, be ambitious and where they should look for.
I mean, I don't think there's any limit to ambition, and that's not a uniquely American or Silicon Valley trait. I think there's lots of people everywhere who have ambition. The reality, though, is that access to capital is more limited, and so in many other geographies, you will have to have more of a focus on revenue and more of a focus perhaps on profitability, as opposed to a lot of the models in Silicon Valley that are very capital intensive and maybe not revenue generating for a very long time. So both Facebook and Twitter are some of the more popular stories that I think people look at, particularly because of the recent IPOs. Those companies were not particularly focused on revenue in the early years. In fact, some would say they're still not focused on revenue. But I think that the lessons to be learned are adapting to the local environments and the local realities. And so a lot of the strategies for companies outside the major capital markets is to look to customers for revenue. Imagine that, people actually buying things. And so you'll see a lot of efforts that are focused around e-commerce, that are focused around paid solutions and SaaS solutions, subscription stories, and maybe advertising or lead gen based technologies as well. So I think that most entrepreneurs outside the Silicon Valley region have to be pretty focused on getting to break even and sustainability, and they may never be able to raise another round of capital if they ever raise one. So capital-intensive strategies need to be thought through, really looking at the unit economics of whatever type of business you're involved with, and figuring out alternative financing strategies if you do need to find capital to grow. But like I said, there's enough activity going on and a lot of other trends that are moving in the right direction, not just demographics, but the reduction in costs for building companies, the increase in access to customers via multiple online platforms, search and social and mobile and local and video. Really, payment systems getting a lot better, even though in most developing economies, online financial methods are probably less than 30 to 50% of market. But I think we'll see that change pretty dramatically over the next 3 to 5 years. I think you'll see in most developing economies, possibly in most of the world, more than 50% of population will have access to financial methods, online financial methods. Not necessarily credit cards, but that'll increase the opportunities for monetization of revenue. Logistics and delivery are getting better. Companies like Aramex in the region and others that are providing better ways to deliver physical products that might be ordered online. So a lot of the points of friction for startups that are outside the US market, those points of friction are gradually being reduced and being made better. And so again, if you're looking at 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, most of the developing markets are going to see much easier access to monetization, much easier access to customers, much easier access to delivery and logistics. And hopefully better access to capital and better access to mentorship. And if we can get all those things really working, then I think you're going to see an explosion of opportunity in a lot of the developing markets around the world. And probably it'll be a wake-up call for a lot of investors who come from more traditional markets to catch up and figure out what's going on. So for people who are early in those markets, both entrepreneurs and investors, that can be a tremendous advantage for when things really start to kick in and grow. We may have to be a little bit cautious about the strategies we employ in the short term before things really start kicking in. But I think my optimism is really strong for the future, and I don't think it's 10 years out. I think it's really 2, 3, 5 years out, and that's within the investment horizon of a lot of companies that might have a 5-year trajectory. So if we're starting businesses now as those fundamentals are getting better, and we're helping provide capital and mentorship, I think you'll see a lot of those companies really start to hit their stride in the next 2 to 5 years and become really big companies in 5 to 10 years.
Excellent. Shifting a little bit back to Dubai, I promise you will be the one before the last question. Dubai has a unique environment. First of all, when you go to Turkey, for example, when we were in Turkey, you'll find all Turkish startups.
Right.
Okay, we go to Jordan, most likely you'll find all the Jordanian startups. Here, you find...
I think you'll find some Syrian and
Syria,
some
Palestinians,
startups in Jordan
exactly.
too.
Here you'll find all kinds of startups, from Russians to Indians to local Emiratis to every kind of thing. Here we feel like Dubai is this very diverse, very multinational, and we believe that it has an opportunity not to be in the next Silicon Valley, but to actually, because of the blend, because of the experience that people bring in, the diversity, it can accelerate that process you were talking about. So what would be your advice to Dubai? How can it accelerate in addition being what it is right now?
Well, I mean, I think the thing that's obvious is the Arabic-speaking market is very local and a big opportunity. So both culturally and proximity-wise, there are big customers in many regions nearby, particularly Saudi and the Gulf states. There's big populations in Egypt and other places to go after. There's the larger Arabic-speaking diaspora that has spread to Europe and even to the States. So that's one very obvious thing. I think the cultural proximity to many different regions, India, Russia, Europe, Africa, obviously all the Middle East states, really provides a great hub for reaching a large market. I mean, probably you're close to 2 billion people, maybe 3 billion people within a 3 or 4 hour plane ride from Dubai. So I mean, for a lot of similarity, there's things that are very similar to Dubai about Singapore and New York and London in having a really strong cultural mix. Also a lot of access to capital markets and physical goods markets that make that a really interesting mix. On the same side, I think there's some challenges to figure out. Even though there's a lot of capital probably here, I don't know that it's all been focused on startups and venture capital. So there's people who maybe don't have as much familiarity with what the startup financing process is like. Again, as I mentioned, finding the entrepreneurs and mentorship to help raise up that group of entrepreneurs here. But I do think that there's a set of opportunities here in Dubai that are probably not the same for people that are coming from the U.S. or even from Europe and Asia. And if you look at maybe even a lot of the opportunities in Africa, I was reading an article by Amr Shadi, CEO of TA Telecom in Egypt. 10 or 12 of the world's 20 fastest growing economies are now in Africa. So you may not be thinking that Africa is the next big startup market. But again, Africa is 1 billion people or close to it, and a lot of that market is Arabic speaking. So there's really some tremendous opportunities here for folks in Dubai that are different, and probably they will have an advantage in those markets that other folks from the U.S. and Europe and Asia do not.
Excellent. And we're kind of very in the Cribb and Turn 8 and i360 accelerator kind of blessed a little bit because we not only have the support of one of the largest corporations in the country, and as you know, Turn 8 is a DP World, Dubai Port World investment per se. It's their investment into the ecosystem. It's very interesting because if you read a little bit about DP World, they're an old traditional organization. Why would they do that? But they have very innovative, very open-minded management that actually believes in this, believes that this is the transformation for Dubai. This is the transformation for what we need to do in the next 20 years as well. So you see very creative thinkers in this country as well, not just from VCs or the entrepreneurs, but from corporations that you never think that will tap into this as well. Let's open it up here for three questions only, because we want to give you time to pitch. Anybody has any questions? Yes, Novel.
Yeah, two questions actually. First, you have invested in, you said 600.
Probably 400 that are alive, but yes, we've done 600.
And how many outside the US?
Between 150 to 200, depends on how you define outside the U.S., whether that's incorporation or presence.
So my question is, how do you see the uniqueness or specific characteristics of the startups outside the U.S. compared to the ones in the U.S.? How they are different?
Usually I will say the local market perspective is that entrepreneurs are not as talented in the local market as Silicon Valley, and I really disagree with that perspective and opinion. If anything, usually it's the investors in the local market that are not as talented as the folks in Silicon Valley, but I'll leave that for another time. The thing that is really probably different, so the fundamental things that are different are usually access to capital and access to mentorship. So the role models and the capital availability are the fundamental things that are usually missing, at least not as very long. But the real intrinsic thing that is usually missing is just confidence. The entrepreneurs, and it's not because they're less talented, it's just because they don't see it around them as often, right? In Silicon Valley, we are surrounded by people who create billion-dollar companies all day long. I worked with a bunch of them at PayPal. I had people who I used to work with who personally started YouTube and started LinkedIn and started other things. And you tend to see the possibility of yourself doing things when the people who work with you did great things, and they're all around you. And I think in other markets, you don't have that concentration of talent. You don't always see people who look like you. They may not be the same color as you or same gender. And so it's harder when the role models aren't right in front of you. And that creates a lack of confidence that maybe you can do it. And I think that's the biggest problem to overcome, is just believing that you can and surrounding yourself with people who are optimistic and people who are experienced to help you get over that and really just understand that you can do it. And the only things that those other people in Silicon Valley had that you don't have is just more exposure to people who have been successful. Or in some cases, people who failed, and understanding that failure is part of that path as well. So to answer your question, again, I would say there's nothing different at all. It's just a matter of time and exposure to success and to failure that will create those same experimental conditions where success can arise.
Excellent. Another question? Yes.
Hi,
Hi.
I'm Katie from Cordova. In the 5 investments that you've made in the region, how did you and your team think about 6?
Yes.
How did you and your team think about exits, and how long you'll be holding them?
To be honest, we don't think about exits a lot because it's very hard for us to control those conditions. What we do think about is revenue-generating businesses and understanding, hopefully, that they can get to some level of sustainability, and then we have a chance for exit. A lot of those investments were made initially with an investor you guys may know, Fadi Gandour. Was the CEO of Aramex and also a really frequent investor in the region. And that was for multiple reasons. One, we felt like he would be a great person for us to work with in investing and learn from. We also felt he probably had good access to downstream investors that would make it easier for those companies to raise money at the next stage. But again, we don't know, and it could be that all 6 of those investments fail, and I don't think that'll stop us from continuing to do more. The primary thing we need to think about in most international markets is the next round of capital or getting to sustainability. That does drive a focus on revenue a little bit more than maybe growth. But it's not dramatically different than our strategy in the U.S. as well.
Excellent. Yes.
Time frame probably is 3 to 5 years, generally speaking, for when we think we might be able to see exits.
Okay, you.
Yeah, Walid Al-Bashir,
Yes.
Stationer.a, which is e-commerce for office supply. We've been seeking such support and ecosystem for the last 10-15 years in Dubai. So the question is, why now? Why do we see all these trendy activities all over the place? Is it related to the economic situation in the States and Europe?
Trendy activity meaning people doing startups or?
No, accelerators and VCs
Accelerators.
coming and all this stuff. Yeah.
Right.
Is that a question to me or?
Well, you may be asking the wrong person because I'm as much a fan and a proponent of that as anyone else. I worry a little bit that we experience some cargo cult sort of behavior, which is we see people doing things that look like success and we copy those things, but we may not always be copying the right things. It may be that those things were just very lucky and there isn't a cause and effect relationship between the things they did and the successes they had. I do think that incubators and accelerators are useful for concentrating talent in a physical space, or at least a close physical proximity, and that provides greater opportunities to learn. It could be you learn from failures as much from success. I think that because of the reduction in costs of building a lot of consumer and software-based startups, much smaller amounts of capital are required to get companies off the ground. So, you probably couldn't have done the type of incubation that is happening now 10 years ago, just because the budgets for getting the startups off the ground would have been 10 to 100x greater. But there is probably there's going to be a lot of incubators that fail. There's going to be a lot of people right now who think an incubator is just a warehouse and a space that's in computers, or maybe a small amount of capital, and it's very hard to get those models right. If we are successful, I think we will find that we are not competing with earlier forms of venture capital. What we are competing with is business schools. And I think the prior best practice of learning about entrepreneurship from reading case studies is fundamentally flawed. I think that although you may be able to learn some things from reading about other people's successes, probably you will learn more from your own failures than from other people's successes, your own first-hand failures. And so the things that I think are useful for entrepreneurs, although reading about other people is helpful, experiencing entrepreneurship firsthand either by trying at your own startup and failing, or working at other companies that are larger where they already have some success and you're seeing operational best practices working. Both of those experiences are useful. I had a relatively small and dismal startup in the 90s that I ran. I had an exit, but it was very small. I would consider that sort of a failure. I got to work at PayPal for a few years, and that was a great experience working with a large company that was still, maybe struggling with some things, but working in other ways. So I think we are at risk maybe of copying a lot of things from Silicon Valley that maybe we're just lucky and maybe aren't necessarily the best practice. But I think with experimentation we will find some successes. But you should inquire about what successes other accelerators and incubators have had, what methods they're employing. It's often not just the space and the money, it's a lot of the other things that go with it that hopefully trend for success.
Excellent. Thank you very much.